Chapter 5 Life Along the Not-So-Romantic Road. Joseph paused before stepping out of the door of the apothecary on the Hafengasse to put on his wide-brimmed hat. He wore the hat neither as a statement of fashion nor for warmth. It was, after all, mid-July, and it would be another hot day 60 meters above the Tauber Valley. Joseph was on his way back to the hospital where he worked. The structure stood on a spit of land that stood out like an extended finger over the Tauber Valley. Rothenburg's hospital, like the hospitals in most towns of the time, had been built as far as possible from the rest of the town in an attempt to keep disease away from the general population. No, Joseph wore his wide-brimmed hat for a more practical reason. He had arrived at the apothecary early to pick up certain supplies that would be needed in the hospital for the day. The early morning was when the townspeople would throw open their windows to air out the house and would throw out the contents of their chamber pots into the streets below. While it was customary to shout out a warning before the emptying of the pots, there was not a lot of time for unsuspecting pedestrians to get out of the way. It only took getting hit by the falling refuse once to learn a valuable lesson. Joseph knew that ancient adage that said, "Shit rolls downhill," but in Rothenburg of the Middle Ages, it also fell from the skies. A good wide-brimmed hat could save one from a ruined outfit, and most citizens didn't have an overabundance of clothing from which to choose. Joseph was not what one might call a paradigm of fashion, but he took pride in his appearance and took necessary precautions to protect his clothing and his dignity. As he made his way toward the hospital, Joseph looked at the middle of the road. Tourists, hundreds of years in the future, would be captivated by the town's quaint cobblestone streets. All Joseph could see was dirt. He smiled wryly at the small ditch carved through the middle of the street. Rothenburg citizens were required to sweep the areas in front of their homes or businesses once a week, propelling all the filth that had collected there into the ditch. There it sat while the citizens prayed and waited for rain. The idea was that the rain would wash all of the foulness out of the town and down into the Tauber Valley. Apparently, the fish and fowl inhabiting the river were not consulted about this plan. Of course, the plan didn't work. Rain was too unpredictable, so the dreck sat in the streets and festered. The horses ridden by the upper class added to the problem. The cattle, oxen, and swine that paraded through the streets contributed to the rising stench. Then, of course, there were chickens and geese that ran wild through the town, fouling the streets during the day until their owners corralled them before dark. Joseph mused about the fact that the smells of animals on a farm were considered acceptable and even reassuring, if not altogether pleasant. When those same smells were confined to the narrow streets of a town, they were overwhelming and close to unbearable. Hundreds of years later, Rothenburg would be the crown jewel of what would come to be called the Romantic Road, but there was nothing romantic about the streets of Rothenburg in the height of summer in the Middle Ages. Joseph was thankful to be out early in the morning. While he knew he would have to dodge the occasional emptying of chamber pots, he knew that later things would only get worse. When the tanners started their work, the reek would peak. And while people enjoyed the benefits of the leather wares the tanners' efforts helped produce, the process required to make the leather exacted an olfactory toll. Tanners began with the skins of slaughtered cattle that were caked in blood, manure, and dirt. After the trimming of these skins, the tanner would then rinse them off into the street. Then the task shifted to removing all the hair from the skin. This was often done by sprinkling the skins with urine and leaving them to rot the hair off. The financially disadvantaged citizens of the town, or the poor yokels living outside the city walls, would save their urine in pots and then sell it to the tanners. That was what it meant to be piss poor. Only those who were truly desperate for funds would lower themselves to selling their own urine. If one was truly desperate, they didn't even have an extra container to contain their urine. It was said that they were so poor they didn't even have a pot to piss in. After scraping the hair off, the tanner would then wash the skins with a solution that might also contain pigeon droppings, dog feces, or additional urine mixed with beer. The process took up to 3 months, so the atmosphere it created lingered intolerably during the summer months. All of those sights and smells were common to Joseph. There was, in fact, no way to escape them within the town walls. While the wealthy could escape the overpowering odors by retreating to their country homes in the summer months, most citizens remained in town and prayed for rain and breezes. Joseph himself had become more or less inured to the miasma, unless he was forced to pass directly in front of one of the tanneries on his way to work. Working at the hospital was not a particularly prestigious position. The role of the hospitals was less about healing the sick than it was about keeping the ill as comfortable as possible and keeping them away from the rest of the population. That was why Rothenburg's hospital, as was the case in so many towns of the Middle Ages, was as far away from the rest of the town as possible, while still remaining within the walls. Still, Joseph knew that the hospital filled a much-needed role. Most people didn't end up at the hospital in hopes of a cure. Joseph knew firsthand that most patients would never be seen by a physician. They could, however, expect basic bodily care from the nursing staff, often nuns or monks, and that care included food, drink, shelter, and a higher level of hygiene than they would experience out on the street. Those things alone provided the sick with a fighting chance to recover on their own, if they weren't too sick. Most of the healing activities took place outside the hospital. Bloodletting was a common practice intended to restore balance to the body's humors. A wide variety of herbal remedies were administered, with questionable results. Interestingly, the herbal remedies that actually worked, such as high doses of pennyroyal, were effective when given to induce abortions. There were, of course, quacks and charlatans in abundance. Superstition was widespread, and magical charms were often peddled to ailing people who were desperate for relief. While the effectiveness of such charms was, at best, suspect, the application would sometimes produce a short-lived peace of mind. Counterfeit cures were sometimes sold to sick citizens or to those who were afraid of becoming sick. People would blindly take medications while completely unaware of their contents to ward off sickness. At times, plant extracts were ground up with the flesh of vipers and other substances and sold as a healing agent and as a powerful antidote to various poisons. Those, of course, were things Joseph knew little about. His work focused on caring for the sick and poor who sought refuge and mercy within the walls of the hospital. He had come by his position quite naturally. Orphaned as a child, he had been dropped off at the monastery, where he was then raised by the monks. the segue to working in a hospital, had come naturally as part of his education and training. It was more or less assumed, although never actually discussed, that he would eventually take vows to become a monk. There was only one problem. Joseph, while an ardent believer, had never felt this calling and hoped and prayed that this decision would be indefinitely delayed, as it already had been put off much longer than was usual for a young man such as he was. When he arrived back at the hospital with his items from the apothecary in hand, he noticed that there was a new admission. The hospital was small enough that even small changes were easily observed. A woman had been taken in who was obviously in need of immediate care. She was dirty, disheveled, and obviously distressed. It wasn't hard to see that she was physically afflicted. Joseph could tell that whatever trials this woman had recently been through had made her look older than she actually was. There was something about her that looked familiar, but fear and physical abuse had given her a feral look that masked her identity and kept her from social interaction with others. Over the next week, Joseph encountered the woman repeatedly as he brought her meals and cleaned the room in which she stayed. He never engaged in what one might call conversation. However, they had exchanged pleasantries. Each time he left her room, he was more convinced than ever that he had seen her before, but he still couldn't put his finger on where he might have seen her. After a week or so, she began to venture out into the hospital's gardens in the cool hours of the evening. Because Joseph lived on the hospital grounds, he would also frequently visit the gardens to enjoy the cool evening air, far away from the stifling heat and stench of the town. On one such visit to the gardens, he happened upon the woman who was sitting on a small stone bench. Uncertain as to what the proper protocol was with patients, much less female patients, Joseph cautiously greeted the woman with a friendly, "Good evening. I'm so glad you are feeling well enough to enjoy the gardens and the cool air." The woman returned his greeting with a thin smile and a subdued, "Good evening." They exchanged comments about the weather, the crops, and the boring things that were going on within the walled town. All the while, Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that he had met this woman before. Finally, he gently probed, "If it's not inappropriate to ask, what is your name?" After a short silence in which she evaluated him with her eyes, she replied, "My name is Frigga." Then she said nothing more and watched his response. Nodding gently, Joseph inquired innocently, "Are you the Frau Frigga from the Gasthaus Greifen?" Seeing no malice in his eyes, she barely nodded. "I knew I had seen you somewhere," Joseph gently replied. It was no sin, after all, to visit a public house for a meal or a tankard of ale, not even for an apprentice such as he. "Forgive me if I am asking too much about things that are none of my concern," he said, "but I thought you had left Rothenburg to return to your family in Würzburg." "Rothenburg is," he continued with a playful wink, "a rather small town, and there are rather few secrets." The woman smiled the same thin smile as before and replied, "You are not mistaken. I was on the road to Würzburg when I was attacked by thieves and sorely mistreated." Then, with a slightly warmer smile, she continued, "And as the wife of the inn's proprietor, I know full well how quickly and falsely news travels throughout the town." Seeing that she had an apt and tolerant audience, Frigga slowly poured out her tale of woe. After her husband's disgrace, the inn had been repossessed by the town council. As a mere woman, and a young one without children at that, she had been turned out. She had gathered what possessions she could and set off for Würzburg to stay with her family. Alas, she never arrived. A single woman traveling alone was easy prey for the robbers and thieves who quickly relieved her of her possessions and what remained of her dignity. She described to Joseph how battered and bruised she had somehow struggled back to town with her face bruised and dirty, her clothes ripped to shreds. She looked every bit of what she had become, a poor, hopeless, homeless woman. She described to him how she had staggered through the gates of Rothenburg with people staring at her in distaste. Because of her physical condition, no one recognized her as the wife of the former innkeeper. Injured and hungry, with no other place to turn, she shuffled her way to the hospital on the edge of town and threw herself on the mercy of the monks and nuns that ministered to the poor and sick. "That is how I came to be here," said Frigga. "At the moment, I have no future, and a past I'd just as soon forget." She then stared at Joseph to gauge his reaction. Joseph sensed that the young woman before him had shared enough for one evening. While he wanted to know more, he knew that to pry into her life would only bring her more pain at this moment. "Well, I, for one, am glad you have landed here," he said. "I'm truly sorry for what you have been through, though I'll confess that I can't imagine exactly what that must have been like. I would very much like to hear more of your story and your thoughts about the future, but I fear I may have overtaxed you with this conversation. You are here to rest and recover. I hope that we will have further opportunities to talk. May I walk you back to your room, or would you prefer to linger a while?" With a smile that acknowledged his graciousness and patience, Frigga replied, "I would be most appreciative of an escort back to my room." And with that, she rose from her seat and walked with him back to her room at the hospital. Over the following days and weeks, the two developed a friendship. There were no hidden agendas or expectations. They simply enjoyed one another's company, and, truth be told, their evening conversations became the highlight of their days. Given their respective positions in life, neither had anything of significance to offer the other. So over the course of her convalescence, the relationship between Frigga and Joseph deepened. Joseph noticed that Frigga rarely talked about her husband. In their conversations, he seemed to be regarded by her as more of an employer than a spouse. Joseph was able to deduce that Frigga's husband had been significantly older than she. While he had availed himself of the privileges of marriage, he had given essentially nothing in return. As she opened up about her relationship with her husband, it became obvious that the marriage had not been close or happy. It also became quite obvious that Frigga had known nothing about her husband's illegal activities. He had made clear that his personal and business activities were, he felt, beyond her comprehension and thus none of her business. "I was shocked and horrified when they took my husband away," Frigga confided to Joseph one evening. "I had no idea what he had been up to. I felt like a stranger in my own home. But when the truth came out and the punishment was delivered, I was considered as guilty as he, though I truly knew nothing. I knew that he had been pilloried and then sent to the emperor, but I was a woman without a home. I fled with a few possessions, hoping to find a safe place with my family in Würzburg. But you know how that ended." Joseph realized that he needed to tell Frigga what had become of her husband. In their conversations, Joseph and Frigga had been quite open and honest. He had already confessed to her his concerns about being expected to take a monk's vows, even though he knew he hadn't been called. She had confided in him her disappointment about her marriage. He knew it wasn't right to keep the truth about her husband from her. "Frau Frigga," Joseph began softly, "there is something I need to share with you. It's something you need to know." She looked at him, puzzled, obviously wondering where he could be going with this conversation. With a voice that was barely above a whisper, he told her, "Your husband is dead. He was executed by the emperor for his treasonous acts. I'm sorry to have to tell you this after all you've been through." Frigga was silent for a moment. A single tear made its way down her cheek. She then turned toward Joseph and told him, "You have no doubt surmised that my husband did not truly love me, and that I, for my part, did not love him. Still, I had hoped to love him at some point and to have won his love for me. That never happened, and now it never will. Thank you for telling me the truth." Joseph was frozen for a moment. If ever a woman needed the comfort of a chaste embrace, this was that moment. And yet he hesitated. His training among the monks had made clear that passions of the flesh were dangerous, and yet what he felt was not passion, but compassion. Without thinking further, he put his arm around Frigga, drew her close, and said, "I am so sorry." She wept cleansing tears of sorrow and relief until her tears suddenly stopped. With a smile that echoed her relief, she said to Joseph, "Will you please accompany me back to my room?" As Frigga's convalescence continued, the friendship between Joseph and Frigga deepened. Something happens between two individuals who share deep disappointments and hurts. Both Joseph and Frigga had known the pain of rejection. She from her family in marrying her off to a man who never loved her, and he being given up as an infant by a mother who didn't want him or couldn't keep him. They shared something that neither of them had ever been able to share with another human being, and it bound them together. It's been said that some marriages are made in heaven, and while the monks of the hospital had played an indirect role in bringing Joseph and Frigga together, theirs was not the fairy tale type of romance one reads about in the storybooks. She was an outcast widow of a convicted criminal. He was an unwanted, illegitimate child with no family outside the church. With no conceivable future, theirs was not the kind of romantic relationship that promised a happily ever after ending. And yet, perhaps, when there is nothing to be gained but love itself, that is the truest form of romance, or the truest expression of love of all. Some say that love conquers all, but even the purest devotion and love doesn't put a roof over one's head. As they continued to meet every evening in the hospital's garden, they not only professed their love for one another, but confessed their concerns about how they might live when they finally married. Staying at the hospital under the care of the monks was not an option, and yet neither of them had a pfennig to their name. Frigga had lost whatever possessions she'd had to the robbers on the way to Würzburg. Joseph received room and board from the monks, but no pay. Night after night, they racked their brains for a solution before they could get married. One night, in the middle of the night watchman showed up at the hospital door, carrying what appeared to be an older man who had been beaten within an inch of his life. The watchman had found him unconscious and bleeding along the Judengasse. There were no lights on the street, and all the homes had been dark. Not recognizing the man and finding neither money, valuables, or identification, the watchman had managed to carry the inert individual to the hospital, where he knew he would get care. No one at the hospital recognized the older man either. He had been so badly beaten that his face was swollen and unrecognizable. The man himself was comatose and could offer no clue as to his identity. Joseph was one of those called upon to tend to him. As he washed the man's face and dressed his wounds, Joseph didn't detect even the slightest hint of alcohol. He was obviously not a visitor of one of the local taverns who had overstayed his welcome. And although the man's clothing was ripped and dirty, Joseph noted that it was of high quality and style. This was no drunkard or beggar. His charge was a man of some means. Joseph sat by the man's bedside through the night, in case he should need additional care. He kept staring at the patient in hopes that he might recognize him, but the swollen face and heavily bandaged head made it impossible to do so. The older man proved to be surprisingly resilient. Despite the horrendous abuse he had suffered, he began to heal quickly. Still, the man remained strangely silent. He spoke only when spoken to, and then only in short sentences. When asked his name, he simply closed his eyes and shook his head.